to the Talent Optimization Podcast, the go-to podcast for CEOs and HR professionals wanting to bridge the gap between the strategy and tactical implementation of talent optimization within their organizations. Through interviews, predictive index, and personal experience, your host, Tracy Shirk, helps you discover the facets of talent optimization from both a CEO and HR perspective to truly create the dream team for your organization. Are you ready? Let's get started.
So what drives communication at work, and what does HR need to do to really ensure that all levels of the organization have the key pieces that they need to be successful? So with me today is Amy Stalker, and Amy is a total rewards expert, and I'm thrilled to have you join us on the podcast today, Amy.
Thank you, Tracy. I'm happy to be here.
So communication, this really fun topic. What exactly does it mean?
So I think communication is a lot of different things. It's definitely the interaction between how we operate, whether it's family, whether it's at work, whether it's with your friends. When you have miscommunication, it could mean a whole ton of things go wrong. When you have great communication, it means a whole ton of things go right. So for me, that's the most important part of any relationship or any, especially at work.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the understanding of, okay, how do we build the trust so we can really have that open, honest communication? And it's not just on our teams, right? But as HR professionals, total rewards, many times we're communicating some really important things like benefits, like pay, like, hey, you got a promotion or you didn't get a promotion, all of those things. So from your experience and, working in really large organizations with this, how do you build that where you still have the personal touch?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it's one that you get wrong more than you get right. And with years of experience, I think there's a couple of items. Number one is, what are you communicating? Are you communicating something that's difficult or hard to understand? Benefits would be in that arena. It's making sure that you know your audience. Who are you communicating to, and how are they going to receive the information? There's a myriad of different ways. You're working with multiple generations within an organization. So just because you put something online doesn't mean that everybody's going to grab it or have access to it. Just because you put something in writing doesn't mean everybody's going to open the mail or take a look at it. So you have to really understand what are your vehicles in order to communicate and who you're communicating to. And I think the third one is transparency. It's all about telling the truth, gaining the trust, building that affinity to have employees really trust you. I know that there's a lot of people who look at their employers for their source of information. It's not so much necessarily television or radio or even other people. It's a lot of times it's a workplace. That's where they've built the trust. And so you have to continue that and make sure that people understand what you're trying to say and how you're saying it, and to be transparent, whether it's good news, bad news. It doesn't matter. It builds that trust versus just trying to kind of cover over everything and sugarcoat it, if you will. So it makes communication really difficult. And that's what's so hard to get. It's hard to build that skill.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes we feel like we've communicated something incredibly, incredibly well. And yet on the other side of it, it's completely missed. I think one of my favorite stories, and this is a home story, not a work story, but so often I will take this story and tell it in work situations. And I have two boys, and they were downstairs playing Xbox. And my oldest son said to my youngest son, hey, can you make this guy invisible? They're playing Fortnite. And I'm like, okay. And E says, why? And Q goes, well, how do you make this guy invisible? And Ethan goes, why? Q, how do you make this guy invisible? Why? Push the button. Why? And he's getting really angry during this. And it's like, when we think about communication, he thought he was asking the most perfectly clear question and that he understood the answer. And E is sitting here going, I told you the answer 5 times. Will you just knock it off?
That is an awesome story. And it's one that I think everybody can relate to. And, think about that with children, and then put that in an adult situation, right? Where you can't overreact. You can't get super upset in a work environment. And so what tends to happen is you fill in the blanks. It's human nature. We all fill in the blanks with what we do know And then the story turns into something that isn't even true, or wasn't what was said. And it's like that game of telephone that goes over and over again. So it's so important to be clear, ask questions back, ask if people understand, and make them feel comfortable to be able to make sure that you're clear and they're getting it. And I think that's another difficult part of being a good communicator, because even the best communicators don't always communicate correctly. And it's, once you realize it, it's kind of like, oh, own up to it, talk about it and move forward with it, but don't dwell on it. Or, I'm sure you being in, consulting, you get these emails, and that's my favorite of, well, I sent out an email. Well, I sent out 3 emails. I'm like, I get 500 emails a day. I'm not reading every single one. Pick up the phone and call me.
Right.
That personal connection, even if it's phone or Zoom or Teams or whatever, gets you so, it just brings you so much further along than caps in an email. You don't get what people are trying to say. You can't read their nonverbals. Pick up the phone. Where are they gone? Where you just pick up the phone.
Absolutely. And I love that. And I mean, just today, I had one of my consultants reach out to me and say, hey, Tracy, can you read through these emails from this specific client? She's like, I want to make sure I'm answering this correctly, and I'm not quite getting it. And I think sometimes you talked about, hey, there's the different modes of communication based on how somebody is wired, just their natural wiring, right? Are they an individual that's extroverted, that thinks through issues, or are they an individual that's introverted, think through issues, extroverted, talk through issues, right? Because that's a huge piece of it, and understanding who we're talking to. But then the other side of it is we're working in a global economy right now. And, this specific client is outside of the United States, outside of this continent. And sometimes it's like there's language barriers that really come into this. And what I loved about her request to me was, I want to make sure that I'm best serving this client, and, that we're really getting exactly what we need. And, many times we'll create different sort of filters to say, hey, we want to make sure that we're communicating that you can understand it. Because it doesn't matter how well I communicate, it matters what you understood, like why and why, right?
It definitely does. And keep in mind, I think, something that I've also learned, and something that I often tell people who work for me or even peers is we try to sometimes make ourselves feel better, right? Yeah. When we want to give bad news, whatever it may be in the HR field, even, we try to make ourselves feel better versus really, is it what's best for them? Or is it what's best for the company or the organization? And you have to be cognizant of that, and you have to be self-aware that we do that as humans. Doesn't make us bad people by any means, but it's like, yeah, I'm not really helping that person. I'm actually helping myself out by softening, the communication that needs to be had, or softening the message, which doesn't do anybody any good.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think another key thing with communication, and you hit on this earlier, and that is there's several different modes of communication, and making sure that we're communicating it based on who our audience is, really knowing who that audience is. But the other question that I think comes up, and I ask this so often, is I wonder what's on their plate that I don't yet know about.
That is a great question. I think you nailed it, right? It's just to say, okay, what else do you have going on? What else do I not know? Whatever you want to share. How can I then be of assistance to make sure that we're in the right frame of mind to have the right conversation? Now, sometimes you can't hold off, no matter where you're at, in life. But I think you're right by saying, are we okay to have this conversation? And you know what? It's okay for people to raise their hand and say, you know what? Not right now. In fact, at work and with my peers, we have code words about, I'm just not interested. Right. And it's kind of a joke between all of us in different meetings that we've been at. I have a coworker of mine who just says it all the time, like, oh, I'm just not interested. And that's what we say to each other. It's like, yeah, not interested. And we all know what that means is, okay, I'm going to come back at that at a later time.
Right. Absolutely. Because that, I wonder what else is on their plate that I don't yet know about. And then being able to say, you know what, there's something here. I'm not ready to talk about what's here. And sometimes you don't have to even talk about it. And that shouldn't be a requirement. But just to say, hey, you know what, maybe tomorrow morning is a better time because X, Y, Z just happened, right? And I think the other thing is understanding that there's things on other people's plates. You mentioned 500 emails a day, and all the multiple communications and whatnot. There's times that things get missed. And it's understanding that, there's times that things get missed, but how do we circle back around before we make an assumption that they're avoiding me or ignoring me or whatnot?
You're right. And I think that there's nothing wrong. And people who I've worked with, I'm very open about, you know what, if you have questions, I'm super informal. So it's kind of understanding how people operate. But I also say, hey, if you want to get a hold of me, send me an email, send me an IM through Teams. But if you call and leave me a message, there's a 150% chance I'm not going to hear it and get back to you because it's not my preferred method of communication. And just be open and honest about that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I love it. One of the things that we've been doing with many of our clients, we use Paylocity a lot with our clients is, it's the push notifications that go to their phone. And guess what? Their paycheck is attached to that. So they're going to read those notifications, right? And as we're talking about communication, I think that there's some current events that have popped up in the last couple of weeks that I think really bring this up into light. And that's the base camp situation where the CEO sent out, the memo to his staff, which essentially said, here's what we're doing. And here's what we're not talking about, which was diversity, equity, and inclusion. So essentially stating, we're not talking about this. Therefore, you have a choice. We're going to give you a buyout or not. So a third of the staff got up and left. And so as we talk about communication and really tying that to communication that drives results, when you start with what result you want, how do you back into the way that you communicate? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the way that I do that and I take a look at it and I think it's always what's in it for me. So I put myself in their shoes saying, okay, what's in it for them? If there's a big change, like the case that you're talking about, or big, paradigm shifts in the way that you operate at a business, it's not okay just to throw it on a spreadsheet or throw it on a PowerPoint and put it up. It's just noise to people. Mm-hmm. A lot of times I compare change and communication to running a marathon. For those of us in HR, we tend to be at, mile 13, right? Like we're already along the change. We're already preparing for it. Now we're preparing to bring people, at the start. And we often forget as professionals that we are already halfway through the marathon and they're just beginning.
Right.
So it's backing up, stopping for a second and saying, okay, if I want them to adopt it, I need them to trust me. I need to be transparent. I need to be open and honest. And I need to make sure that I understand what's in it for them and try to build that way and be open about that, not just throw things, up on a screen, if you will, because we have a tendency to do that. And then we check the list, right? It's a check the box exercise.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that prioritization, I think one of the keys to communication is what priority level does this fall in for who based on who my audience is?
Priorities. Wow. I think we all can go into work every single day and say, okay, I'm going to get this, and this done. And we come out 4 hours, 5 hours, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours later going, I literally got nothing done on that list of my priorities because things are thrown at you every single day, whether it's a fire in HR, putting something out and fixing a problem or whatever it may be. It could be a family issue or whatever. It's hard to do that. So I think we all begin our day with a priority and we try to end with, clear-headed. I'm a big believer in leaving work at work when you can. Mm-hmm. So whether or not it's a 10-minute drive home or, talking on the phone or whatever, and kind of getting your head straight. What am I going to accomplish? What did I accomplish today? What are some wins that I can take with me for the day? And then move on to tomorrow and see what we can prioritize. And there's nothing wrong with saying no and making sure that you empower your employees to be able to say no in the right situations. Of course, there's those that you just can't. But I think it's really important that people are able to do that and say, you know what, I have too much on my plate. Or what do you want to drop? What do you want to come off in order for me to get that done? We don't do enough of that.
I absolutely love that. And in the previous podcast, so if you go back to episode 18, we actually talked about something that we use in our organization called Easy Weeks, where essentially we're stating, what are your priorities every day? Where are you constraining your focus? And really communicating with the rest of your team that these 2 hours are focus time. And you've got your email on offline, you've got your Teams turned off, all of the things, but everybody knows that, right? And yet my team still knows if there's an emergency that they need me, they can text me, but otherwise that time is off limits, right?
You are correct. And I think organizations forget that. And I will say, especially US organizations are probably the worst. Working in a global environment, it's definitely not that way everywhere. I think us as Americans have a tendency to just, we work, and that's just who we are. And I think we all have to make our own personal rules. Me, myself, I will work late into the night, but when I am done and I turn my phone off from work, it's off. It doesn't come to bed with me. I try not to have it on during the weekends, and people know that about me, but during the week, I'm available pretty much all the time until, I go to sleep, and then it's, I'm done. And
and I think especially in HR or in the executive suite, right? There are so many pulls on your time. And if you're not setting those boundaries as to this is work time and this is family time or whatnot, those get crossed. And there's emergency situations, absolutely. But there's also the random PTO calls at 11 o'clock at night that's going, this is not important. And we have an obligation to train our staff that those things need to happen during the work hours.
I think you're right. I once worked, this is a few years ago, but just to bring some reality right into our conversation, I had a coworker of mine who thought that if she sent out emails and scheduled them for 4 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the morning, that she was really working really hard and she wanted people to see that. And it actually blew up on her, where there was conversation saying, you know what, don't do that. Then people feel like they have to emulate you to grow, and that they're expected then to be answering emails and sending them out at 2 and 4. And we know you're scheduling them. So be cognizant of other people's time. And I think some of that, again, in a global organization is if you're sending information over to Europe or into, Asia or wherever it may be cognizant of that and use the scheduling in the email so that they do get it, let's say at 9 o'clock a.m. their time.
Right.
So that they're not bombarded when they first get into work with all of these different emails of, oh gosh, that's how I'm starting out my day. Like, we need to be better at that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So we always end our podcast with 2 key questions. And, that is, what is one key takeaway from our conversation today for those executives listening in?
Yeah, I think for me, one big key takeaway that I can't stress enough is the transparency piece. I don't think organizations today, and not all by any means, are as transparent as they could be. We're all adults in a company. We can take the good with the bad and the bad with the good, and trust that the employees know what they're doing. And they'd rather know. I would rather know. I hear from my employees constantly. I'd rather know what's happening, even if it's bad, so I can better plan and I'm not surprised. So again, transparency is key.
Absolutely. And what's one of those key takeaways for our HR listeners?
Yeah, I think for HR, exactly what you and I were talking about is just being self-aware of how you're presenting yourself, especially for leadership, HR leadership. The organization looks at us. They look at us to lead. They look at us to be the pioneers of whatever it is we want the organization to feel from a culture perspective as well. So just be self-aware of, when you're contacting employees, what you're saying, how you're saying it, and how you are advising other leaders to lead, especially when it comes to communication. I think more is better. Even if you're uncomfortable, be okay with being uncomfortable. That's what makes us human.
Absolutely. Awesome. Thank you so much for this conversation on communication that drives results. And if you loved our conversation with Amy today, in a couple of weeks, Amy will be back talking about how we create talent pathways in the organization. And it's one of those topics that's a bit different than probably what we typically think about. So if you are interested in following her, you can find her on LinkedIn, and that will be in our show notes. And, if you love these conversations, please take a look at our Talent Optimization Foundation program, where we have office hours and live webinars every single Monday at 1 p.m. Central. Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Talent Optimization Podcast. You'll find more tools and resources for CEOs and HR professionals looking to bridge the strategies versus implementation gap of talent optimization at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. We've also created a free, valuable resource for you to begin bridging the gap called the Talent Optimization Foundation Membership Program. You can access it for free at elevatedtalentconsulting.com/foundation. Be sure to tune in next week for another episode to learn more about talent optimization and creating a dream team for your organization.